Have you ever dealt with a tenant situation that completely tested your patience or thought, man, how do property managers do this at scale? Or if I'm as an investor and I want to have one house and scale it to 100 units of apartments, how am I going to deal with all these tenants? And so, one of the things that makes rental properties unique is obviously you're dealing with people that are living in a property that is their home, but belongs to you as the ownership, right? So, it's that dynamic of keeping residents happy as much as we can while following the law and making sure that we're not discriminating and stuff like that. So, oftentimes we'll get a call from a self managing landlord. We just had one in the last week where resident was coming up for renewal in a few months. The resident had just been submitting a lot of maintenance throughout the year. And this is a property that doesn't really have a lot of deferred maintenance. It's over 3,000 a month. So sort of higher end stuff that we might have here in Tampa. And, it's just something that we want to take an objective look at first is make sure, are we doing the right thing as landlords providing good housing with the right standards that somebody can live in? And then identifying what is the resident actually asking for and are they uneducated about what is in the lease. So kind of all starts from documentation, right? The lease is going to drive the relationship, and self-managing owners oftentimes just get worn out with some of their tenants, and that will be a reason also that they might hire a property management company, especially if they know that they're too nice. Simply, we've had owners say, "Hey, I just know I'm too nice. I just need a better buffer between me and the resident to sort of handle things." There's a lot of other reasons someone might hire a management company, but that's something that we see actually fairly often. So it's not our intent to come into the relationship and just start, with this sort of big bad representation of us as property managers and, we're just going to like crush the tenant in the property, right? So a lease is going to drive the relationship. So sometimes it's just educating the tenant on what's in the lease and what did they sign. You'd be shocked at the amount of tenants that don't really read the lease before they sign it. So that's step one, making sure the property is properly repaired at a good standard. Two, making sure that the lease is explained to the resident or just reinforcing. Maybe it's something that they forgot was actually their responsibility. There could be a lot of other situations wanting to add multiple occupants. It could be different lease violations that you're dealing with. They had a pet, they didn't tell you about it, all that stuff, right? So the documentation piece is really important if things start to get out of hand, especially if it's repair related or the tenant's paying on rent on time, but they keep violating the lease, right? So those are things that you want to be able to document and show, especially at a multifamily property where one resident could be possibly endangering the safety or just causing a disturbance to the other residents, which may in turn make people start leaving the property, right? So it's something that we want to approach open-minded, understand what's the situation, what's actually happening, what is the resident actually asking for, what's the easiest solution, but enforcing the lease, right? That's what we're paid to do, is to make sure there's standards followed, especially on multifamily properties. When you have a lot of people living in a similar space, there has to be a strict standard of what's being allowed on the property and how they're expected to interact with it. So proactive communication, keeping the resident updated, letting them know what it is, and they may not like what you have to say, but you're enforcing the lease. If things really get out of hand, you can simply just non-renew the resident when it's time. But we really just feel that it comes down to communication and enforcing what's in the lease. And again, residents may not like what's in there, but that's where over time, over 10 years, we've built a really strong lease. And we have a resident handbook that accompanies the lease that dives into extra details around different things that they should be doing to keep up with the property, the different rules that we may have for the property. And again, it could have just been something where they didn't understand or didn't read thoroughly through that stuff prior to signing a lease, even though, their signatures on it. So when you have a resident that's getting a little out of hand and you're self-managing, documentation is going to be really important. If the lease is a little bit vague, you just have to use your best judgment, right? Vacancy kills cash flow. So if it's something that's in a little bit of a gray area, you may just want to own up as the landlord and allow something to happen on the property, or you may want to pay for a repair that's not necessarily your responsibility, but it's a little vague in the wording. And it all goes towards that renewal concept. If it's a resident that has traditionally been paying on time and you would like to keep them there, common sense, being a decent human being, that goes a long way in how to approach some of this stuff. So if it's a situation that arises for us, and lease is really strong, but there's just some weird circumstance, it's just going to go to the sort of our track record and history of how we're going to handle something to determine the right path forward. But especially when it comes to multifamily properties, and you might have tenants that are sort of arguing or complaining about parking and stuff like that, there's some small things that you can obviously do to make it more obvious of how they should handle themselves on the property. But at the end of the day, people are people, and sometimes we recommend residents to, have their own documentation that they can submit to us because it could just be hearsay. If it's two people living on one property, we want to make sure that we're getting an accurate story of what's going on. And if there's always safety related things that are coming through or endangering potential occupants, that's where we always are, from a liability standpoint, always recommending to the resident, you either need to call the police or non-emergency police line if there's something that you feel, your safety is being compromised. Because as a landlord, as a property manager, if somebody gets sued, we're all going to get sued. So we want to make sure that the resident feels safe. We're doing what we can to ensure that's happening on the property. And if people are violating it, having the residents that are reporting it also have documentation, or if it's really serious enough, then they should be willing to call something like the non-emergency police line to have extra documentation to help us understand what the situation is, and if we need to take steps to actually get somebody removed from the property. So at the end of the day, documentation is important. The lease is going to be important, and communication. So hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.